You've heard AM, you've heard FM. Now, tune into DM Radio, the world's longest running show about data. Each week, host Eric Kavanaugh interviews the brightest minds in the world of information management. Want to be on a show? Send an email to info@dmradio.biz. Now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio, and today is a very special day, folks. We turned 16 years old. Yes, 16 years ago. I can't believe it. That's crazy. That's like just over a third of my life, or I don't know. I'm getting old. Not quite a third of my life, I should say. That would be 48. But geez Louise, man, 16 years, it's been a rough and ready ride. We've been learning about data for all that period of time. And I knew it was going to be big back in 2000 and in 2001 when I got a job in Austin, Texas for Damon Consulting, all about data warehousing and ETL and business intelligence and all that stuff. I knew it was going to be big. It got so much bigger than I thought. And then what happens? AI comes along and it's now 10 times bigger than it was before. It's of crucial importance. Data quality is so important. And folks, I'm so excited to have two rock star experts in the data world on the show today. We've got Kevin Kline from Solarwinds and Malcolm Hawker from Profisee. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. And let's dive right in. So, data quality, I keep using this analogy and it's fun, so I'm going to use it again. Training an AI model is a lot like raising a kid because you have to be very careful about what you expose it to. You don't want to expose your kid to all sorts of foul language, and then they'll start cursing back at you. I remember the first time I cursed in front of my daughter, and she said it right back at me. I was like, oh, I can't believe I did that. Once you've trained the model, you can't really untrain the model is the problem. So you got to be very careful about this stuff. AI needs very high quality data. So we're going to talk today about data governance, about master data management, about security, about a whole bunch of different things. And let's just dive right in. So we've got Kevin Kline, not the famous actor, but he is a very good actor. And this Kevin Kline, I think, knows a lot more about data and security. So Kevin is with Solarwinds. Welcome to the show. Tell us what got you into the data world and how big a deal is quality these days?
Such a pleasure to be here, Eric. Thank you so much for having me. You know, I got into the data world in the late 80s, and I got a job working at NASA because I was really good with Fortran, and I knew how to write a select statement, which was cutting edge in the late
Yeah.
80s. And so we'd write our conditional code in Fortran and run it through a compiler wrapped around the SQL statements, and then Oracle could have something kind of like a stored procedure in those days. And talking about data, our database grew to be practically infinite in size for that time, which was about 128 megabytes. We were just stunned how big it was. Yeah.
That's a lot of data.
Isn't it?
Back then.
Yeah. So, at that time, I started to write. So I've written you might know my name as the author of one of the most popular books on SQL, SQL in a Nutshell, from O'Reilly and Associates.
Nice.
Yeah. And so, when I was working at NASA, at that time, it was small data sets compared to what we have today, but it was all in support of the air and water recycling system. It was called ECLSS, the Environmental Control and Life Support System that's in the International Space Station. And we used a lot of early algorithms back then, Monte Carlo method and some of those different algorithms for predictive analytics. But at the bottom line, lives were on the line, right? We can't do without air. We can't do without water. And we can go a little while, but not long. And so quality of data and analysis was of the utmost concern for us at that time. And I've been fascinated by it ever since then.
That's a pretty cool starting point. And as you suggest, when lives are on the line, that's when you have to pay real attention, right? And so you've seen things change so much, but really it's still just code, right? It's code hitting silicon, hitting hard drives and making things happen. And, we haven't learned too much along the way. We seem to be making some of the same mistakes, but we are learning some things. That's a fun question. What's one thing you learned fairly recently that kind of blew your mind in the data world?
That's a tough question, and I'd actually kind of flip that on its head. And this is where um, products like what Profisee bring to market are actually much more important than I think the average data professional realizes. And that is that the problems that we face today are really human problems,
Mhm.
right? When I was working on that life support system data back in the late 80s, smaller data sets, but we had tools, we had algorithms, we had methods to work properly with that. Whenever we fell behind, it was because there were arguments between different team members or
Mm.
territorial disputes between who owned what. And moving forward all the way through today, it's the same human interactions that we keep screwing up and getting wrong,
Mm.
right? So we have developers who don't know what a database actually does. They don't realize, locking or blocking. Oh, we have DBAs who think that developers, just don't care. And so they just get it out as fast, and so it's the human condition. Uh, Everything old is new again, sort of. I keep getting surprised by that. I keep thinking, oh, we're getting better. But really, we as people, we're still the same as we were 1 or 2 generations ago. It's the tooling and the processes that are better. And
Mhm.
so when we begin to realize that our organization doesn't have a data management strategy, it doesn't have a data governance strategy, and then we begin to look at the best practices that have been developed and tools that can assist us in getting there, that's when things get better.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. And you're reminding me of a better question I should ask you here. I'm actually going to give you my theory about something, and I think you'll probably agree that the way AI is going to manifest and the way it's going to help us do our jobs better is with reminders and with little guardrails along the way. So you look at stuff like Copilot, for example, with Microsoft and all the other versions that are coming out. These are recommendations that are coming to you based upon patterns that are recognized. So alerts, for example, and alerts are nothing new. We've had alerts for 40 years in programming, but alerts coming from AI fueled systems are going to be much more targeted, much more personalized, and much more relevant. And then guess what? You can also track from a business perspective when your employees heed the alerts and when they don't, right? It reminds me of pitching. I'm a big baseball fan. I'm so proud of myself that my daughter is a huge baseball fan. She loves the Pirates. I wish she loved the White Sox, but what can I say? We're in Pittsburgh now. She loves the Pirates, all right? And one thing I've noticed in baseball, when that pitcher shakes off the catcher, I'm like, "Oh, dude, what are you doing?" The catcher knows what you should be throwing now. Shakes off the catcher and then go for ball, home run, right? So what do you think about that theory that AI is going to largely make suggestions to us that we can take or not take?
That's absolutely the case. I mean, although I'm no longer a DBA now, one of the things that I frequently had to do with the development teams I worked with is teach them the nuances of, let's say, SQL statements. The database itself has an optimizer, so it will choose what it believes to be the best execution plan.
Right.
And sometimes in doing code reviews, we'd say, okay, now we're using an anti-pattern here. We're doing something wrong. And they'd say, oh, I don't know if you're really right about that. And I'd say, okay, well, you're forcing me to go and prove this empirically, right? And so, and talking to many other DBAs that work at that level with their dev teams, one of the things they would have to do is constantly battle and reprove in 100 different companies across America on any given day, reprove the same things.
Hmm.
Like, subqueries in some cases are going to perform much worse than a join in a SQL select statement. And so now what we're able to do, like you mentioned, Copilot, what it does, in some cases, it even goes out and searches Stack Exchange or Stack Overflow and finds that answer that is already empirically vetted and
Right.
says, here's why you shouldn't use this particular anti-pattern. And so, absolutely, I feel like this is going to be a turning point for a lot of people to have kind of consistent standard of education on how your code should work, how you should approach the problem, and best practices.
I think that's a fantastic answer. And let me segue and bring Malcolm Hawker into the conversation here. I'm a big fan of cliches, and I learned one from a girl in New Orleans like 20 years ago that I had not heard, and it's a good one. She just said, "When you know better, you do better," right? And so to know these things, and now we're in this era where if you open your mind to looking at the sources, if you are open to suggestion, it shouldn't take you very long to learn what's a good way to do something and what's a bad way to do something. So, but you have to use the tools, right? And to Kevin's point, the humans can still choose to not do things right. They could still fight about, in politics and whatever. But at the end of the day, if you're paying attention and you use what's available to you, you should be able to get pretty far pretty fast. What do you think, Malcolm?
Couldn't agree more. I'll give you a very specific answer or example of the kind of no more, no better, right? And one particular use case here is graph technology. So this is something that's really exploded on the scene. I was in Austin last weekend at Day, Texas, and graph was probably the belle of the ball, as it were. Graph, everybody talking about it. And there's a very specific reason why. And I think it has to do with what you just shared, Eric, which is forever and ever and ever, we know that there are unknowns. We know there are unknowns out there that mean something, that are valuable, but because they're unknown, we don't know what they are. But there's an awful lot of knowns as well. For example, customers. We know customers are very, very important. And we also know relationships between or within customers are also important. But for a long time, we've had a lot of data just buried out there, just buried, because we like to hoard data and separate conversation about the sustainability of our hoarding practices.
Right.
But there's a lot of data out there that would help inform and provide insights on relationships we didn't even know about. A really basic example is I lived in a mixed family with multiple last names, where some of the kids have gone off to school that they're still dependent and have completely different addresses. In an MDM use case, that would be a problem, right? Because you get a name and you get an address and you'd run it through MDM and you'd be like, these things are not even related, right? One says Hawker, one says something else, different address. But in the world of graph, you can throw a lot of data into a graph and you can run the relationships and you can create the nodes and you can start to understand pretty quickly. Actually, these things are related. That's the unknown that you didn't know before.
Right.
When you layer in AI on top of that and on top of those insights, things can get really, really powerful, really, really quick. Historically, in Kevin's world, in a data modeling world, the humans kind of drove those decisions. The human would build the data model. The human would determine what was important based off of intuition, based on some basic discovery and profiling processes, based on maybe looking at what some of the KPIs the executives cared about, and on and on and on. They would try to understand what some of the relationships were, and some of them were overt, right? Like maybe a B2B relationship between companies, and you would join those tables together, and that would make sense. And the human would do their best to model the actual representation of the data.
Right.
But the world we're living in now with graphs and with AI, they can tell us things that we didn't even know about that are very compelling and to help augment data modeling. And I would argue maybe even one day to fully automate it. Now that's a bit heretical to a data modeler. They don't like to hear that stuff because they think there's as much art there as there is science.
Right.
But I think we are approaching a world where we can go to augmentation, just what we're talking about, having the machines tell us things that we didn't know about to inform us, but actually one day even get to automation for some, not all use cases, but for some, for sure.
Yeah, I think
absolutely
so.
agreed.
Yeah, go ahead, Kevin. Comment on that. Go
Oh, no further comment, just to say right on.
Well, so check this out. I did a webinar late last year with Vertica. OpenText now owns them, and I've known a bunch of people over there, wonderful people. Vertica, of course, it's been around forever now. Dr. Michael Stonebreaker, column-oriented database. I remember I interviewed him when he was pushing it at the very outset back in 2005. I told my colleague, I interviewed some guy named Stonebreaker. And he's like, Stonebreaker? Really? Wow. I was like, oh, the guy who invented the modern database, right? And in the database world, like you said, you have inner joins and outer joins and all these different things that you can do. And I realized, you know what? Large language models don't care about that. They don't care about inner joins, outer joins. They're like, whatever, we're just going to give you what we think you want. And yes, there are these hallucinations you keep hearing about, which is why you want data quality, which is why you want data governance, which is why you want a good embedding strategy to train your model. And I think it's going to be really important to get off on the right foot. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. Both gentlemen here, Kevin Kline, I talk about training a model is like raising a kid. Well, if you give them the wrong training early, it's pretty hard to change. That stuff gets baked in. The early rules get baked in pretty deeply. And that's why actions speak louder than words. But what do you think about the importance of training the model well right from the outset, Kevin?
You know, it's without a doubt true. And the when you're talking about rearing children, my first experience with bad training input was in the grocery store when one of my, a toddler decided to yell a word that I had said earlier that day, which I just wish hadn't happened. But
Nice.
yeah, to your point, and this also goes into really important aspects of AI around, say, bias, for example. There are so many biases that are possible, and it depends somewhat on the kind of AI functionality that you're trying to build out, whether it's facial recognition and race, for example,
Right.
is a big deal. And another example of that is not only master data management, but reference data management. So one thing I point out to my up and coming friends in the data space is why use data and try to build your own data sets internally and clean those, wrangle that data, ensure its quality when you can buy that data from a number of well-reputed vendors who have already done all of that hard work for you.
Right.
Things like DUNS numbers and all of those kinds of reference data sets that are universally used by, the smart money. And
That's right.
people just don't know it. They don't know it
Yeah.
exists. And so
That's a really good point. Go ahead, real quick. Got 1 minute left till the break. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
I've got more than 1 minute. So we can let the break happen, but I'll tell you, Kevin, it's interesting you should mention DUNS numbers. I worked at DMB for 7 years.
No kidding. Okay.
Yes, I did. And you're absolutely right. If you have the opportunity to utilize a reference data source that is curated, governed, steward, managed for you, that's great. Now, is it going to be 100% fit? Probably not, but nothing's 100%. If you can get to 70 or 80% from the perspective of understanding what is accurate about a certain set of data, whether that's information about companies or weights, measures, dimensions, anything like that, you'll never get perfect. But if you can utilize those insights that somebody else has invested to curate, put all the stewardship in and the governance in, that's a great way to turbocharge any data related initiative, whether it's a BI initiative or an AI initiative.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm reminded way back in 2002 when DM radio was just a twinkle in my eye, I would talk to all these different software companies and would all have their own metadata repositories. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, but wouldn't it make sense to have a sort of master metadata repository that like lots of organizations could key into, and then we'd all kind of be on the same page? And we'll
That's
pick that one up
interesting.
after the break, folks. You are listening to DM Radio.
What if
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio. Just turned 16 years old. Pretty excited about that. Got some rock stars on the show. Malcolm Hawker from Profisee and Kevin Kline from Solarwinds. And Malcolm, I'll throw it back over to you. Training. You wanted to jump on the training bandwagon. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, so I hear a lot of people talking about, okay, are you confident in your data to be used to train AI? And I think we need to be careful about what AI are we talking about, right? If you're one of the 50% of companies that has a data science function, that's my estimate, it's around 50%, has some form of a data science competency or some sort of role for data science. And you're building your own models. Maybe you're building propensity models or birds of a feather models or other models. Yes, absolutely, positively, you'll be using your data to build those models, and you need that data to be consistent, accurate, trustworthy, all the good things we need to do to make sure that we can trust the data, make sure it's high quality. When it comes to large language models in particular, you're not going to be training a large language model. That's because they're becoming highly commoditized, and there's only a limited number of companies that actually have the wherewithal to do that. I'll give you an example. Bard, kind of the open source LLM, the first iteration of that had 7 billion parameters, and it took 6,000 GPUs running for 12 weeks straight, okay, at a cost of about $12 million, just to create the first iteration of their LLM. not many of us have 6,000 GPUs just kicking around that they can dedicate for 12 weeks straight to generate one of these models. Now,
Right.
so I don't think we're going to be training LLMs. What we might be doing is this process called fine tuning, which is a little bit different. And it's interesting because the fine tuning and all the training of these LLMs actually happens through natural language processing. We're throwing a lot of text at these algorithms. We're not throwing rows and columns at these algorithms, which is an interesting phenomenon. I just wanted to draw that distinction though, because I hear a lot of data leaders out there saying, I can't use my data to train an LLM. Well, chances are you don't need to. And the good news is they're becoming highly commoditized. We've already figured out the patterns of language. And the biggest of the big are already figuring all that stuff out. You may, through open source versions of those models, be able to fine tune them. You may be able to give them questions and answers to help them lean a certain way. Like maybe you want to, kind of branch an open source LLM to have it be focused more on healthcare, to have it to be more focused on high finance. And that could be a valid use case. But when it comes to actually training an LLM, probably not, but training other models, absolutely.
Interesting. Kevin, you want to comment on that?
It is something that I am seeing as well with customers, in which they want to augment an LLM with their own internal jargon, source that perhaps from documents that they have written, their thought leadership, their internal development, product development programs or sales programs. And a friend of mine somewhere down the line said, I've changed jobs a couple of times in my career, and what I figured out is that once I learn the jargon, I can do most anything. I'm a smart person. I just need to know what they're talking about. And once I know that, I'm good. And so that's what I see a lot of end users, customers, enterprises using, and not just the well-known LLMs too. There's quite a few that are open source. There's several others that are less prominent, but still available for you. Stable Diffusion, for example. A lot of people don't talk about that, but there are different kinds of models out there. So customizing that, fine-tuning it, just as you said, Malcolm, is really the challenge for most enterprises right now.
So there's two real paths here. One path is open source, right? Where you can see the code and you can tweak the expected behaviors of open source LLMs like Bard. And that process is going to be fine tuning. And yes, you still need to have trustworthy insights that you are using to tune the model. Then there's closed LLMs like the OpenAIs of the world, right? Where they're not started as open, it's not so open anymore.
Right.
But how you try to control those models is today through something called a RAG pattern, retrieval augmented generation, where what you're doing in essence is creating a really elegant prompt. So OpenAI today can actually take 300 pages of text in a single prompt, right? There's a lot of tokens there, and that will be an expensive question that you answer. So be careful with that. But you can throw 300 pages of text at it. What we're seeing more and more and more is that within the prompt itself, what you can do is to tell an LLM, a closed LLM, a commercial LLM like OpenAI, what you can do is you can tell it, you can give it known facts. You can say, if these things I'm about to give you are true, are known to be true, then do an analysis of this set of data, then make a recommendation based on this set of data. So that's where the need for having accurate, trustworthy, consistent, high quality data really, really comes into play. Because if you are telling the LLM, hey, I know these things to be true and give me a summary of these truths, and they're not, well, that could lead to suboptimal outcomes, to say the least.
Yeah, and let's dive into this a little bit because I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. So with RAG, with retrieval augmented generation, you one of the things that you're doing, if I understand it correctly, is you're doing embeddings. You're basically embedding, like let's say in a vector database, because you can do two things. You can either fine tune the model, or you're actually you're putting your data into the model. Essentially, you're training it on the model, or there's a vector database where you're telling it, okay, and one guy referred to these as Brian Raymond from unstructured.io. He called them anchors of truth. And I love that concept. I'm like, oh, that is clever, right? They're moorings, basically. You're saying, all right, but when you put the prompt in, if I understand it correctly, it doesn't the engine will come up with its ideas, and then it goes back and it looks at the vector database to just kind of double check, and then it gives you the answer. Is that about right?
I believe that to be the case. I don't know. I couldn't tell you the specific order of operations, but what you described, I know to be true. So I'll give you another example. A friend of mine, Juan Cicada, data scientist at Data.World, just published a paper recently where they improved the accuracy of responses from LLMs by including a knowledge graph as a part of the RAG.
Nice.
So you
love that idea.
throw data that was extracted from a graph that provides a whole bunch of additional context, right? That today doesn't really exist that well in our rows and columns because the context is buried in the joins, right?
Yes.
Kevin is nodding, he knows.
Or keys, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But where a knowledge graph, when you throw this information and you throw it against the LLMs, you've got additional context, and it's like, aha, now I can use this as a fact set to do whatever I'm doing, to come up with a recommendation or make a calculation. So 30% improvement, what Juan has seen. I think there's going to be more and more research done here. 30% is greater than zero. Probably not where we ultimately want to get to, but I see these things as being very, very interesting and positive. And where I think in the future, we won't be talking about hallucinations anymore. It'll be kind of like, yesterday's news, right? This is so early. This reminds me so much of the beginning of the internet. We're all old enough to remember, like when you had to hand key an IP address into a menu bar into a browser, and that's kind of where we are now. That's how I look at it.
Yeah,
and I like to think of it also like there was a time when it was wise not to really put your trust in Wikipedia. But now it's very solid. It's a good encyclopedia. And if mistakes are put in by someone, they're taken out by someone almost as quickly.
Yeah.
And so that, and just to underline what you're talking about in terms of the increasing acceleration we're seeing here, as you had said, Eric, vector databases have been around for a long time and all the concepts around graph, but what we're seeing, in my work with SQL and the ANSI ISO standards committees, that's what they're working on, is enlarging the SQL standards to include standardization around graph and vector databases. And so this is going to, a year or two from now, when these standardizations hit, we're going to see further acceleration because now we're all talking, if not an identical language, an understandable dialect.
Well, and one of the first observations I made when playing around with ChatGPT, whatever it was, 7, 8, 9 months ago, something like that, I'm watching this, I'm going, wait a second. If this thing can speak in French and English and German and Dutch, I'll bet you it can speak in COBOL and Java and C++ and C Sharp. And yeah, it can. Right? And it's waiting. So my buddy, Dr. Osama Fayyad, he runs the Institute for Experiential AI over at Northeastern University. Super cool guy. He was the first chief data officer for Yahoo. So he's been around. He had something to do with Hadoop and all that stuff. And he was saying, we had him on the show a couple of weeks ago. He was like, yeah, this is really not that scientifically fascinating. It's just a system of weightings. But, when you factor in the transformer models, and I have a thread going with Mr. Schmidhuber, who wrote the papers, and he wrote the papers in the 1990s. That's what's kind of interesting, right? He wrote these papers in the 1990s, and now in this age, it was his ideas that opened the door for these transformer models, which is basically like, if I understand it correctly, before the engine could see like 2, 3 tokens left and 2, 3 tokens right, which is not very much vision. And still it did a pretty good job. But now I can see like 10, 12 left, 10, 12 right. And you've got what I call sort of a Greek chorus of recommendations. So there's this Greek chorus there going, I think it should be this, and this guy, I think it should be that. Eventually the decision has to be made. Okay, it's going to be this letter and this word, etc. But I think we're kind of underestimating, or some people are underestimating, the power of this model, because I mentioned about inner joints and outer joints and stuff like that. Was like, well, how exactly is this thing coming up with what it throws at you? Because it's very accurate. And what I've learned is for technologies in particular that are fairly well known, about which there is quite a bit published, it's going to do a really good job, like how routers work or how a motherboard works, things of this nature. There's enough information out there that it can pattern recognize what's going on. Although that reminds me of a great quote by my buddy Alex Husky, who said, he works for ExxonMobil. He goes, we cannot allow these things to keep pattern recognizing their way to the truth. And he talked about a beautiful mind and how it was actually some ground truth that allowed him to crack that code, right? So you have to give it truth. And that's kind of what you were talking about, Malcolm, where you're like, if these things are true, analyze this and tell me what's going on. These models do need ground truth in order to really get it right. But what do you think first, first Kevin and then Malcolm?
Well, and again, it's a crucial component of all of this in that we have context. So let's say, for example, we were making inquiries of our LLM and around flight attendants. Well, if we are looking at the history of flight attendants for whatever reason, well, there was a time when they were only called stewardesses.
Right.
Right. And so you have to have that understanding. We need either, taxonomies, we need metadata management so that we can tell a lot of things about our data, tagging and things like that. So like you said, there are these other elements of the Greek chorus that we also have to make sure are also advancing and also taking into context all of the different aspects of what we're asking for it.
And things change, right, Malcolm? I mean, the meaning of
Yes.
words will change over time. Like there's a couple of really good ones. People say there is no honor among thieves. That's incorrect. The original expression is there is honor among thieves, but things get changed over time. Oh, what's the other good one? The exception proves the rule. Well, when you hear that today, you're like, that doesn't make any sense at all. But the expression originates back when the word prove meant test. And in that context, it makes perfect sense. The exception tests the rule. Yes, it doesn't prove the rule. So you have to watch out for these slowly changing dimensions, right, Malcolm?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I've made a career out of the fact we struggle with semantics. I'm grateful for the fact we've got different names for different things or similar names for different things, and the fact we can't agree on a universal language.
That's fine.
But I'll go back to something you said a little while ago, Eric, related to I bet you this thing can speak COBOL, right? And Farsi and Mandarin and Python and Ruby, and it can. Funny thing is, though, is that those programming languages were not part of the initial training set. Not part of the training set. So there was a fascinating part. So I watch a lot of Lex Friedman podcasts in addition to DM Radio. And Sam Altman was interviewed by Lex Friedman about this very thing. And when pressed, I'm paraphrasing, of course, I'm not going to quote directly, but when pressed, Sam Altman did not have a valid explanation as to why some of this, in this case, OpenAI was able to recognize a language that was never part of the training set. I think it can come back to, there's just universal kind of patterns that exist here. It's all languages and it's all easily explainable. This kind of falls into some of the camp of the people that see these LLMs as just nothing more than this fancy parlor trick that kind of guesses what the next word is. I don't fall into that camp.
Right.
I think there's something here that is far deeper. I was reading and watching something related to power laws that I know very, very little about, but how power laws can potentially explain the behavior of a lot of natural systems, right? And how maybe even Fibonacci sequences naturally just exist within nature, and like rivers and heads of cauliflower and all sorts of other things. Without getting like way too philosophic here, I think we may have, universal royal we, but may have stumbled on something in the way that the universe works that we don't fully understand yet.
Wow. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to DM Radio. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on DM Radio. What a fascinating show today with Malcolm Hawker from Profisee and Kevin Kline from Solarwinds. We're talking all about the importance of data quality and artificial intelligence. And Malcolm made a couple of really, really good points about what you're going to train and what you're not going to train. When you get, let's say you want to have a new pet in your life and you get a dog that's 15 years old, not going to train that dog to do a whole lot. That dog is going to do pretty much what it's been doing for for the last 14 years and 11 months. But if you get a young dog, then you got to start young. Then you can train. Then you can kind of shape and mold and do all this sort of stuff. But in the AI world, there are certain options that you have, and there are all these different models coming out, and there are new ones coming out. And Kevin, maybe I'll throw this one over to you. I'm of the mind that we are going to get deeper, and it's probably going to be thanks to Meta because it's open source and maybe Bard. OpenAI, of course, is not open at all right now, which is yet another irony of life. They have a very black box, closed approach, which I question. I think that may not be the best idea, but I think this RAG concept is going to get significantly more sophisticated, and we're going to get better and better at dealing with what my business partner Eugene Burke calls he says that these LLMs don't have an epistemological barrier, meaning they don't know what they don't know, and that's when they make stuff up, right? But I think we're going to get a lot better about that in various architectural ways. What do you think, Kevin?
Yes, and there's no doubt that we've already seen so much improvement in just a short period of time. So there's no doubt that we're going to continue to see more improvement. One of the things, though, that I find at the business level, when we talk to different organizations who are looking at generative AI kinds of solutions, is I'll use an old economic term from Federal Reserve Chairman Greenspan, who said irrational exuberance, if you remember that term.
Yes.
And so I'll go back to my original premise on that, which is you can expect great things, but you have to fix or remediate so many different data quality issues that even well-run data organizations, data analytics inside of a big company often miss. For example, so many companies have so many silos that really important data is hidden. It just simply isn't exposed. The marketing team knows their stuff. The sales team knows they don't share that with the engineers, who would love to hear what the feedback the salespeople are. There's hidden data. So it's not that the data is wrong or incorrect. It's just not present. And so that's why I go back to my original premise of we need to improve our governance. Because when our data governance program says no more silos, we're going to share this information across our organization, that alone was enough motivation in the 90s and the 2000s and the aughts for many companies to go in that direction. But now that we can combine generative AI with that, you can do so much more, not 10 or 20% more, but 10 or 20 times more.
Wow.
And so it's the kind of thing that's going to necessitate a variety of changes in organizations that want to do this well.
Wow. Yeah. What's the old expression? A necessity is the mother of invention, or something like that. And I think you're right. I mean, organizations are going to have to stand up and deal with this stuff. Malcolm, there's a lot of people sitting on the sidelines right now thinking, oh, I heard just yesterday some Fortune 100 companies like, oh, we're not going to touch Gen AI because, if these lawsuits come out, we'll be parties to the lawsuit. It's like, okay. I mean, I think this Gen AI stuff is like data warehousing times 100 in terms of its impact, in terms of what it's going to do. And look at all the money that people threw into data warehousing, and we got that wrong half the darn time, right? And they were brittle and slow and expensive as hell. And then Snowflake came along and let you spin them up and take them down, and spin them up and take them down. So, the table stakes are now so much higher than they were 2 years ago that companies have to pay attention, right, Malcolm?
They absolutely positively have to pay attention. And I would argue that if you are a CDO or a VP of data and analytics, or even a senior manager of data and analytics out there right now, and you're saying, hey, wait, I need time to figure this out, that is you're putting yourself in an existential situation. You don't want to do that because, you asked for time. We asked for time 10 years ago to figure out the big data thing. We asked for time 4 years ago. 3 years ago, when the business asked us to digitally transform and digitally accelerate in response to changing consumer and supply chain patterns that were emerging because of COVID. And if you're asking for time now to get your data house in order, don't get me wrong, you must get your house in order, but it is not a hard dependency. You need to figure out ways to leverage this amazing technology now. And there are ways, there are use cases that are more friendly to less accurate data situations. Maybe it's a chatbot for your customer service. Maybe it is building a simple model to help you understand, which customers are more likely to buy something next. But there are ways to leverage this amazing technology, and we need to do it sooner rather than later. So it's a walk and chew gum. The walk is do something quickly, find a use case that can be supported now. But the chewing gum is get that data house in order. Kevin, I love the comparison back to the silos, and we need to break silos because that's near and dear to my heart. I'm an MDM guy, and it pays my mortgage, and I couldn't agree more. But Eric, tying back to something you said earlier, if you can imagine that there are economies of this scale that exist when you break silos in an organization, if you started to view the organization as a silo itself, there are economies of scale that could be exposed when you break silos exist across organizations. Classic example is a single ship gets plugged in the Suez Canal and global supply chains melt.
Right.
This suggests a level of interconnectedness like nothing we've ever experienced before. And we saw this coming out of the pandemic about supply chain disruptions. It's not enough anymore to know who your supplier is, right? You need to know who your supplier is. And there's an X to the N number of possible relationships there because it's their suppliers as well.
Right.
That's a level of scale that only I would argue only AI can help deliver against. And that's the stuff we need to start figuring out.
That's an excellent point. And on this topic of really leveraging AI, and we'll have a podcast bonus segment coming up here too in a few minutes. But I'm going to throw this to each of you, and let's see what you say. Everyone's talking about having your own private instance, right? Like having your own private instance of ChatGPT or Bard or whatever. How, and from a security perspective, because of course Kevin Solarwinds is known as a security company. From a security perspective, how feasible is this? And then how is that actually working? Because I know you can spin up your own LLM. You can download the source code and you get the machines and like set up your own environment, which would be kind of expensive and probably not worth the effort. But how feasible is that? And is that the direction most companies are going to take, in your opinion?
At least in my experience, and probably more limited than Malcolm. So I'd love to hear your input on this, Malcolm. But in my experience, most organizations are using one of the major cloud hyperscalers. So they're not choosing to build this internally because it's hard. And as you had mentioned earlier, Malcolm, 6,000 GPUs to build that first LLM. If I had to buy that myself and amortize that, I think my CFO would, pummel me for that kind of expense. So I have not found that to be something that is widespread at this point, building your own private instances and things like that. What I've seen is more along the lines of using one of those cloud, the most popular of the cloud vendors. What are you seeing, Malcolm?
Well, yes. But it's not just one. It's generally multiple cloud providers. But in the case of let's just say Microsoft, and this could be all of them, but Microsoft has got a 49% stake in OpenAI, so it's a good use case. Derek, to your point, is it enough to run your own instance of OpenAI in your Azure tenant? Yeah, I would say that is enough because you're getting the latest and greatest, and you're getting upgrades through OpenAI, but you're paying for it, right? If you are one of the 50% of companies that is investing in data science, are you going to want to run that in Azure? Maybe you want to have some other environment. So just as we've seen multiple environments emerge over time, I think there will be multiple data science environments. There'll be one where it is out of the box, shrink wrap, what works, and that'll be the democratized version of AI. There'll be other places where it's the realm of just data scientists. So I think it's a many here. It's not just a one.
And there are lots of options. I mean, you've got multiple options today, and it's changing so fast. And one of the things that Dr. Fayad says is that bigger is not necessarily better in this world. Like Mistral's got this mixture of experts, I think they call it, where it's an array of smaller models. And that's when things get really, really interesting in my mind. I mean, we did a show on interactive AI earlier this year, and that's where it's going to, I think, really blow some minds, is when you get these bots that are very good at doing specific things, and you can kind of set them loose to go find me a security problem, and like ding 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 ding, just kind of bounces around and looks for some weird pattern, then goes bing, I think I found something, boss, and then you go look into it. But I mean, this environment they're in, folks, is just absolutely amazing. Like think about one of these AI engines as your incredibly knowledgeable assistant who will do whatever you ask of it and very quickly and without even complaining. Podcast bonus segment is coming up next.
No.
All right, folks, the 16th birthday show of DM Radio is rocking and rolling here. Your host, Eric Kavanaugh, with Malcolm Hawker of Profisee and Kevin Kline of Solarwinds, a fantastic show all about data quality for AI. And Kevin, I'll throw it over to you first, and then, I'm sorry, Malcolm first, and then Kevin. For the people who have been sitting on the sidelines and are hearing the show, they're like, all right, we got to get our ball rolling. What would you recommend? How do you start this journey of leveraging this technology responsibly?
Well, I think it starts with focusing on one of the commercial LLMs, right? And if you aren't already playing with that within your data and analytics function, if you don't already have people trying to figure out how to leverage the value here, you need to start. Start with any low-hanging fruit and start simple. Find a use case that is going to align to the type of behavior that you can expect from these systems, right? Maybe, again, it's a customer service interaction. Maybe it's some sort of internal chatbot, right? Where you could set up a very basic RAG pattern where in every query you throw over the employee handbook as a part of the query. When an employee is asking about medical coverage, what's covered for me? Like, is this, I'm going to get a filling at the dentist, is that covered or not, right? Like very small little use cases. Find a willing partner within the business who may be a little more innovative and maybe a little more forward-leaning, but has a specific business problem, right? Like we get a lot of internal questions about our HR policies or when the vacation schedule is for this year, right? And I'm picking on HR, but this could be anything. This could be sales and marketing use case. This could be a finance use case.
Right.
Find one that is relatively low risk. Maybe it's internally facing, right? That's why I kind of like an HR use case where you can put a box around it. But go find a willing partner on the side of the business, start playing with this stuff, figure out a way to drive some value so you can show to your board, hey, look, let me give you a little demo, right? It used to take us a week through our, help at hr.com to answer the questions about what's covered and what's not covered. And now we can do it real time through our HR portal about what's covered.
That's such an excellent example. And you're reminding me of a show I did this morning with Kate Strachan on her Dedicated show. I threw out something I learned from Jim Harris. And it's just such, look at that. And he's calling me. The Matrix is real, folks. This says Jim Harris. I don't know if you can see it. He's calling me right now as I mentioned his name.
That's
Okay. The
hilarious.
Matrix is
He
real.
knows.
That's too funny. So we were talking about policies and documents and getting summaries of things, right? So think rules and regulations. Think laws, for example. The Congress are passing 1,400-page laws. No human being can read that stuff and understand it in any meaningful period of time, but a large language model can. You can feed that sucker right into a large language model and then get a 2-page summary, get a 5-page summary. The rules and regulations, policy stuff that is so dense and for years has taken expensive experts to be able to do for you. Now you can do all that stuff yourself. Anyway, what do you think, Kevin? How do you think companies should get started?
I agree more with what Malcolm has said so far. Procedurally, I would say the exact same thing, which is similar to what I would have said 4 years ago to groups and organizations interested in starting data science programs. Start small, get your victories and get your experience in early. You can build momentum and grow from there. One other very distinctive thing about all things AI these days, generative AI in particular, not so much on machine learning and so forth, but I always come back to talent as well. And so I think more than many of the other new things that we see, like I said, I started at the tail end of the mainframe business. So I've seen so many transitions from mainframe to mini computers to client server and Web 1.0, Web 2.0, all of that stuff. And the early adopters who do really well will find the right talent who can really strongly utilize this. And am I talking about the strongest technologist on your team? Actually, no. What you really need in a situation like this is people who have strong critical thinking skills, who can understand, okay, here's the potential things we can deliver with this. Here's our potential inputs. So I can connect those dots intuitively, much like you might ask a songwriter, help me understand what is romantic, right? You got to get the right people for that. So critical thinkers who are also creative. So your earlier your point, Eric, about something like a spider crawler, but for information. Where are all my security issues?
Right.
Instead of just looking at what's the sitemap of all these websites. Wow,
Right.
that's amazing.
Right.
In a legal context, we've got people who spend days and weeks looking at case law for their depositions so they can cite precedent. What if we have machines that can do that for us?
That's right.
So we need creativity as well. And that's not always the strong suit for many technologists that you and I are friends with, right? So I think to do an exceptional, now you can do a good workman, journeyman level job without having that. But if you do have that, the results will be something really special.
Wow. That's a great way to end the show. And folks, what a fantastic program today. Look these gentlemen up online. Malcolm Hawker from Profisee, that's Profisee. And of course, Solarwinds. Most people know Kevin Kline. Thank you for your time. Happy birthday, DM Radio. We'll talk to you next time. Send me an email, info@dmradio.biz. You have been listening to DM Radio.